From Elanco, this is Rediscovering the Power of Healthy Animals, the podcast that explores how healthy animals, from cats to cows, can help us overcome some of today's most critical challenges. I'm your host, Michelle Calva-Lorenzo. You're listening to episode 7, entitled The Power of Protein, How Animal and Plant-Based Proteins Differ. If you've gone through a drive-thru at a popular fast food restaurant or shopped the meat department at your favorite grocery store in the past few weeks, you've probably encountered some of the latest and greatest in plant-based proteins. The plant-based protein market is booming with big names like Tyson, Kellogg's, Hormel, Conagra, and Kroger, all making inroads into the category. Popular restaurant chains, including Burger King, KFC, and McDonald's, are also embracing the movement with new protein alternatives from Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods. As demand for protein continues to increase on a global scale, it's no wonder new entrants are met with open arms. But do these alternatives replace the need for meat and other animal proteins in our diet? How do the health benefits stack up when comparing the two? And what factors are driving this recent craze? Here to help us answer some of these questions and discuss the differences in animal and plant-based proteins is industry expert Alexandra Lewin-Zordling. Alex is the founder and owner of Fruitful, a consulting business that specializes in a wide range of food, nutrition, and public health issues. Her work focuses on the cross-section of policy and research and food, nutrition, and public health. Alex has extensive experience in this area, having worked with several major players, including the International Food Information Council Foundation, the United States Department of Agriculture's Food and Nutrition Services, and the AARP Foundation, where she oversaw the organization's hunger and nutrition research strategy. Thanks for joining us today, Alex.
Thrilled to be here, Michelle. Thanks so much for the invitation. I'm excited to talk all things protein today.
Yay. Well, we're excited to talk about all things protein too. So let's go ahead and jump in. And so for today's episode, I'd really like for us to not just discuss the role of protein in our diets, but also how various protein sources differ, because food is all we talk about, right, Alex? It's a topic that's frequently written about. And to be honest with you, for me, it surfaces to the top everywhere I look. And often it's followed by contradicting expert opinions. And so getting it right is important. And I'm sure it's true for our listeners as well. But we all may find it very challenging to get it right sometimes. And if we look at the state of the world's health status, we find that the prevalence of both obesity and malnourishment is steadily increasing on a global scale, right? So let me throw some stats out there for maybe you to respond to, or maybe for our listeners to learn a little bit more about. We know that 1 in 4 people suffer from hidden hunger, which is also called micronutrient deficiency, which means that a person experiencing hidden hunger is eating food that essentially creates a shortage in essential vitamins and minerals, which can have long-term irreversible health effects and socioeconomic consequences. We also see that obesity rates continue to rise, with 13% of the population now classified as obese, and approximately 10% of people are malnourished globally. Right? So a lot of very eye-opening and stark stats there for us to respond to, and especially tying us back to this discussion on protein, right? So maybe you can start us off with, Alex, by talking to us a little bit about the state of what people are eating and the trends in what you're seeing consumers wanting.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Yeah, I'm happy to. You started at the beginning by saying food is everywhere and consumers are confused, and they certainly are. It's a double-edged sword, right? Because we have so much information at our fingertips, yet at the same time, this flood of information can really confuse us. So before I go down that road, I just wanted to pepper in a few additional stats on obesity and chronic disease to really hammer home the point that even though consumers are trying to eat healthfully nutritious foods, whether it's snacks, breakfast, lunch, or dinner, 40% of adults in the US are obese, triggering an annual medical cost of $147 billion annually in the US alone.
Wow.
So that number it's pretty staggering. The last thing I'll just mention about the obesity stats is we see obesity rates rise as kids get older. So as they get into their later teen years, the obesity rates creep up and up. This is due to a range of factors, some of which I'm going to talk about next in terms of where the confusion might lie when it comes to eating healthy diets. So we see from research that we've done on older adult, younger adult, millennial, even Gen Z, Gen X consumers, that this broad range of young adults to older are relying on so many different sources for nutrition information. And you could probably guess what the number one source is: friends and family.
Yep.
So everybody likes to talk about food, right? But our friends and family create this effect where if somebody adopts, say, a Whole30 diet, or they go on paleo, they talk to their friends, they talk to their family, and sooner rather than later, their friends and family are adopting those diets without a whole lot of science necessarily behind it as to the reasons why. When it comes to who we trust for nutrition information, we trust dietitians, we trust healthcare professionals, yet those aren't the most heavily relied on sources. So we see this distinction or discrepancy between who we trust for dietary guidance and then who we're actually relying on.
Wow. Yeah. And so there's a gap there, right? So who we trust, but who we're actually going to. And that leads to a lot of
Exactly.
decisions. Yeah, a lot of different decisions.
Yeah. So when we see how that trickles out into what we're actually eating, we see different things come to the fore. We see this year, one study that I was involved with showed that clean eating and intermittent fasting were the top two diets in the US. So this to me signals a couple of things. It signals that consumers want rules, but they want rules that are flexible and that they can personalize. Yet the science behind these diets may or may not be there. And what I mean by that is when consumers choose these diets, they choose it with an eye towards healthfulness or weight loss or cardiovascular health. But what they're really choosing is a diet that they believe aligns with their personal values, and that those values may or may not be related to the nutritional quality of the food that they're eating. So again, we see this gap in trust and reliance. And then there's this other gap in terms of perceived healthfulness as it relates to our food values and actual nutritional quality of the foods that we're eating.
Wow, really interesting. And I wonder if our listeners are thinking, wow, there's a lot more that goes into my decision-making process than I thought. I know I am. But what about food labels, Alex? What are you finding in your research that consumers are looking for when they're looking at food labels? Or are you finding that they're really confused and don't even know where to start when they're looking at food labels?
Yeah, so I'll give you one example. So we know that when consumers go to a supermarket and they look for food, taste and price drive purchasing. Food values and the environmental piece of what we buy is increasingly important, but taste and price are number one and number two year after year. That said, environmental sustainability, consumers say, over half of consumers say that environmental sustainability is a purchase driver for them. So you asked about labels. What to a consumer signals to them that something is environmentally sustainable? And I give this example because I think it underscores some of the confusion piece. So when you ask consumers, what is environmentally sustainable product? What does it look like to you? How do you identify one? You get such a broad range of answers. You get, it's a product that's locally grown. You get, it's a product with no added hormones. You get, it's non-GMO. You get, it's organic. There's kind of an endless list of what signals to a consumer that something is environmentally sustainable. So consumers, when you ask them what labels are you looking for, they respond by saying things like natural, no added hormones, local, organic. But again, it's the conflation of our values as health. And sometimes even looking at labels and thinking that it's going to bring environmental health. But when you drill down and you say, well, what does this label actually mean? There's not a whole lot there. So there's a lot of confusion when it comes to environmental sustainability. And one of the points that I want to go back to is, as we think about the next set of dietary guidance, and Michelle, I'm sure you're going to go down this road, and what the 2020 dietary guidelines might bring on and the importance of those in what we eat, that should be the sort of foundation of our diets. And the labels and our values can add a lot of noise. And some of it is backed by science, but not everything. And it's important to rely on credible sources like the dietary guidelines to help us navigate that path.
Absolutely. And, myself as a scientist, and I know you are as well, I know that a lot of us from the scientific field definitely support that notion. So you don't always find that being the case though, right? So Alex, do you overall, given all these different consumption trends that you're seeing or choices that consumers are trending towards, do you as an expert in this area think or determine them to be good choices, especially considering, again, to go back to the heart of this conversation, that we have elevated prevalence in obesity, malnourishment, and chronic diseases in society?
Yeah, so I want to go back to a couple of things. One is, what do the dietary guidelines say? If you look at it from just the MyPlate lens, so in case consumers aren't familiar, MyPlate is essentially the translation of the dietary guidance from the United States Department of Agriculture and Health and Human Services into what consumers should be eating on a daily basis. And one of the things that MyPlate recommends is to make half your plate fruits and veggies, and an overall shift towards more plants in our diet. The way that more plants in our diet gets translated, so essentially more fruits and vegetables, is to essentially create an entirely new marketplace out of plant-based products, which to me are very different than eat more fruits and vegetables or add fruits and vegetables to your plate. And so one of the unintended consequences potentially of this emphasis on a plant-based diet is that you're seeing more and more growth in the marketplace of plant-based burgers, plant-based chicken nuggets, plant-based sausages, which in a consumer's mind, again, it aligns with their personal values if they're seeking something that's, say, non-GMO or has green leafy labels on the cover. There's this feeling that consumers are buying something that's healthy. But when you look at the nutrition information and the ingredients, it may or may not be actually healthier than animal-based protein. So that's one example where you see the sort of mix of dietary guidance, where we're getting our information from, and our food values all at play and culminating in this kind of meteoric rise of plant-based burger trends.
Wow. Well, what about the nutritional benefits, right? I know you were alluding to that and hoping to hopefully discuss with us about, again, the 2020 dietary guidance and just the general basic 101 on nutritional benefits. And so why don't we touch on that and talk about it from the lens of plant versus animal protein, so that we can learn a little bit more about how those sources of protein are valuable to our diet.
That's a great question. So I'm going to give a very specific example from both the beef lens and the dairy lens, because I think it's important to, as a consumer navigates a supermarket, they don't necessarily think about plant-based foods broadly. They think about, should I buy this exciting new plant-based burger, or should I buy this beef burger or turkey burger, or should I buy coconut-based yogurt, non-dairy yogurt, or should I buy the yogurt I've always bought? And there must be something to this new product, and I wish I knew more about it. So let's start on the burger side of things. So consumers, what do they want out of the foods that they're eating? Most of all, consumers want a couple of things. They want to either maintain or lose weight. They want cardiovascular health. Increasingly, we see an interest in digestive health. They want energy, and they want to preserve their long-term health and independence. So what matters when you think about those things? Consumers are looking for the amount of calories in food. They're looking for saturated fat levels, cholesterol, sodium, importantly, as we get older, fiber, protein, you name it. So let's take the burger example. If you look at the plant-based burgers and you look at just the number of calories and you're taking, say, an 85% lean ground beef burger compared to burgers like the Beyond Burger or the Impossible Burger, which several of your listeners have probably seen on the shelves of their supermarket. Mm-hmm. The calories are actually pretty comparable. Ground turkey is actually slightly less, so 170 calories compared to about 250 calories in the others. But if you compare plant-based burgers to a beef burger, it's comparable. Okay. When you look at fat, the same, comparable. When you look at saturated fat, it actually tends to be slightly higher in the plant-based burgers, which is really interesting. It's not necessarily something that consumers would know unless they turned over the package and looked at the nutrition information. Right. But it is something that the dietary guidelines emphasizes as not healthy.
Right.
So saturated fat is certainly something to keep an eye out for. Mm-hmm. Cholesterol, there's actually no cholesterol in plant-based burgers. And there is some in beef and even turkey. So that's another point. Sodium. So we know sodium is so important, whether it's high blood pressure, other health conditions where we're trying to limit our sodium intake. Sodium is very high in plant-based burgers. So comparing the Impossible Burger or Beyond or others, you see upwards of 400 milligrams of sodium in those burgers compared to a beef or turkey, which is 80 or 70 milligrams by comparison. So there's a really big difference. When it comes to carbohydrates, there's none in beef or turkey, and there is some in the plant-based burgers. And then when it comes to protein, it's comparable across. Mm-hmm. So, it depends. If you're someone who eats a beef burger every single day of the week, a plant-based burger might be a good alternative to help limit your cholesterol.
Right.
But the majority of us are not eating beef burgers every single day of the week. And if you're someone that, say, is interested in clean eating or fewer ingredients, oftentimes a beef burger is just beef, mm-hmm. whereas a plant-based burger could be over 20 ingredients. So there are trade-offs, certainly, and I think ultimately when it comes to this plant-based trend, my hope is that consumers gravitate towards more of those whole foods, plant-based whole foods, as well as animal protein. So things like soy or nuts that provide, or beans that provide a lot of nutrient density, but maybe a little bit less of the processing. So one thing I also wanted to mention about plant-based burgers or plant-based proteins is it's sometimes harder to get a complete protein or find the same nutrient profile that you might find in animal-based sources. So vegetarians or vegans tend to have a harder time getting their nutrient needs when it comes to things like B12 or zinc, which are very prevalent in animal-based sources. So it just takes an extra discerning eye if you're going after these plant-based protein options to make sure that you're getting complete proteins and that you're creating an overall diet that meets your protein needs, not just from maybe a label sense, but also from an absorption sense. So we know also that some of the nutrients available in animal proteins are absorbed more readily than they might be in plant-based proteins. So keep an eye out for that. If you have any questions, it's important to talk to your healthcare provider or dietitian. When it comes to, I'm just going to give one more example. When it comes to dairy, this one's really interesting to me too, because you walk down the dairy aisle and you see limitless options for yogurt, for smoothies, for milk, for butter. I mean, you name it. You could spend all day trying to figure out what to buy. My daughter recently got put on a no dairy diet as a result of trying to figure out if it would help her eczema. So I went down the dairy aisle trying to figure out, okay, what options exist that are non-dairy that could give her the amount of calcium that she needs, that could give her protein, that are low in saturated fat, all of the typical sort of nutrient composition that you'd find in low-fat dairy. And it was really tough. So I bought a couple of non-dairy yogurts, and the one that I looked at this morning had 35% of your daily allotment for saturated fat. And for a child, it's actually even higher because their diet's not really based on a 2,000 calorie diet. So that's a lot of saturated fat in one serving of yogurt. There was also no protein and no calcium. So wow. I thought to myself, well, what does this food offer her? And it wasn't a whole lot beyond satisfying her from a taste perspective. And that is, has its pluses and minuses too. So the trade-offs are hard when it comes to milk. Some of the plant-based milks are fortified, but many of them aren't, and many of them lack the key nutrients that are found in traditional dairy products.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that personal story with us, Alex, because that's obviously near and dear to your heart. And imagining many of our listeners who may be tackling similar issues within their families, they're not dietitian or nutritionists by training, right? So it's good to hear your perspectives and share how you've learned and how you've overcome some of those even situations from the personal perspective. But talking about your daughter, that makes me realize that there's many different segments of our population, right? We've got our young people, our children, and then we've also got our average age folks, I guess, as you can say, but then also our older, more senior aged folks within the population. And it makes me wonder, are there certain populations that we should pay special attention to when it comes to thinking about protein and the different protein options available?
Totally. I'm really glad you asked that question. So when it comes to older adults, by definition, start to lose muscle mass and muscle strength, and protein becomes increasingly important. Thankfully, research shows that older adults know this, but it's not always easy to eat a diet that's sufficient in protein. And so having these animal-based sources alongside plant-based foods is oftentimes improves the nutrient composition of an older adult's diet. It also does one other thing, which I failed to mention when we were talking about the burgers, which is the price point and the accessibility of these foods. So oftentimes plant-based proteins, particularly these more heavily processed things like burgers and sausages, tend to be pricier than their animal meat counterparts. And so if you're thinking about low-income populations that might not have access to an endless budget, say, beef burgers or turkey burgers or chicken burgers might be more accessible than some of these plant-based alternatives. The other population which I want to highlight are kids. So it's really easy, like I said, to get kind of sucked into the vortex of these plant-based options. They're new, they're pretty, they have such good packaging. But actually, there are new recommendations specifically around beverages for kids under 5 that came out of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation recently. And it explicitly says that kids under 5 should not be regularly consuming plant-based dairy products because they're not nutritionally equivalent to dairy. And so while adults might want to be interested in trying these alternative options, it's important to consider the nutrient needs of kids. And I think Robert Wood Johnson did a really nice job laying out recommendations when it comes to beverages around sugar sweetened beverages, juice, dairy, etc. And one of the key recommendations was to not necessarily include plant-based milk products in your child's diet.
Wow, that's really interesting. So this what seems to be a very simple topic that we talk about every single day with everyone we know, right? The topic of food and nutrition and diets, it's actually so much more complex, and you've really laid that out so nicely for us, Alex. So there's all these different factors like, our values, our health conditions, the age within the population, whether we're talking about older adults or our children, and even price points. I mean, this just goes to show show there's a lot more to this. And I guess maybe that's why it's great that there are many options out there, but it's important to be informed about those options, right? And what the true benefits are, and hopefully turning to the right person for guidance, for nutritional guidance, so that you honestly and wholly can fulfill your nutritional needs for yourself and for your family.
Exactly. It's a great point. And, I would urge consumers as they navigate the supermarket aisles to turn over the packages and look at the nutrition facts panel and look at the ingredients list. And one of the changes that's actually about to happen over the next year is an updated nutrition facts panel where the Food and Drug Administration has been working to make it even clearer and more simple for consumers to navigate things like the amount of calories in a particular package or serving sizes or added sugar, things like that we know consumers care about and which have a scientific basis from which they're drawn from. So keep an eye out for those changes on the nutrition facts panel and just turn over the package because there's a lot of labels on the front that may or may not be more symbolic and may or may not be based on nutrition guidance or nutrition recommendations. And so the nutrition facts panel and the ingredients are really the best indicators of what's actually in a product.
Great advice. Thank you for that, Alex. So before we wrap up, I'd like for you to play this fun game that we call our Fast 5 questions. And so these are 5 questions that help our listeners get to know you a little better. Okay? So we'll go ahead and get started on that. So question number 1, how would you describe your job to a child in 1 sentence?
I guess I would say I write and talk about food and why we make the decisions to eat what we do.
Fantastic. How about your favorite animal? What is that?
Hands down, horses. Not unicorns anymore, but there are just some things we don't outgrow from our childhood.
That's wonderful, and that's very true. So number 3, who are your heroes and role models in your industry?
There are several. I'll give you one, Jose Andres, who many of your listeners probably know at this point. He's certainly not just my hero. He also threw out the first pitch at a World Series game the other night.
Yeah.
But he's just done so much in terms of the food insecure population. And he's here based in DC where I live. So he has a pretty large presence in the city as well.
Oh, what a wonderful role model. He's a big hero of mine as well, I think. Just wonderful chef, and huge kudos for all the work he's done for providing meals for those dealing with the aftermath of natural disasters. So what a great hero. Okay, number 4, what podcasts or books would you recommend?
Great question. I would say 2. The Sporkful, it's a podcast that's actually quite funny. They make light of lots of different food issues, and it makes food just so joyful and fun. And Splendid Table, tried and true. Many of your listeners probably listen to it. It's a cooking podcast, and it's just a wonderful, relaxing way to spend an hour.
Wonderful. And last question, what is today's greatest challenge that animals can positively impact?
Yeah, I think we touched on this a little bit, but by and large, we know that consumers want healthy, nutrient-dense foods, and they want it on the go. They want convenience. And so hopefully this animal protein piece of a consumer's diet can provide this option at an affordable price point.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Alex. We really appreciate all of your expertise. But before we go, do you have any final thoughts or remarks for our listeners today?
Just thank you for having me. I was thrilled to be on. Should anybody have additional questions or thoughts, I would love to hear them.
Great. Well, thanks again, Alex. Your expertise has been incredibly helpful for me, and I'm sure our listeners.
Thank you so much.
I hope this conversation gives you, our listeners, a little boost in confidence as you continue to sift through the various options you encounter when buying meals, and also when reading articles, reports, policies, or even dealing with the multiple opinions you hear on a daily basis related to diet and nutrition. Thanks for listening. If you want to explore more and rediscover the power of healthy animals, visit www.elanco.com/rediscover and be sure to tune in to next month's episode.